So I'm going to, I've included a poem before we move into my Bumpy Beloved Belonging sermon from John O'Donoghue, an Irish poet and teacher. And he wrote an elf called For Belonging. And I've got the text up there, but most of you probably can't even see it. It's kind of rude to do that, so I'm going to read it to you. May you listen to your longing to be free. May the frames of your belonging be generous enough for your dreams. May you arise each day with a voice of blessing whispering in your heart. May you find harmony between your soul and your life. May the sanctuary of your soul never become haunted. May you know the eternal longing that lives at the heart of time. May there be kindness in your gaze when you look within. May you never place walls between the light and yourself. May you allow the wild beauty of the invisible world to gather you, mind you, and embrace you in belonging. So some of you here may remember when we gathered around the fire last solstice celebration that I announced, because I was invited to, not just weirdly, I was invited to announce that my word for 2024 was belonging. So I've since been thinking and reading a lot about what belonging means to me, means to a whole bunch of other people, from poets to scholars and friends and people in corporations and all sorts of stuff. So today, I'm going to share a little about what I've learned on this journey that's just beginning. And I actually suspect that I've kind of gotten into this now. And someday in a few years, I'm probably going to write about it a little bit, because that's what I do. I write things down. Because it's important to my family, to my church family, and to my work world, and to the bigger world. So thank you for being here while I think out loud about what I've learned so far. So let's go to the next slide. Now I don't have a lot of slides because I'm not Michelle and can't come up with so many slides. So that's the slide until we get to your assignment. I'm giving you an assignment at the end, I'm a professor. But until we get to your assignment slide, this is just the slide. So enjoy the slide and just think and listen. So let's think about that poem I just read from John O'Donoghue, where he ended, may you allow the wild beauty of the invisible world to gather you, mind you, and embrace you in belonging. Let me read more from this inspiring author. I'm reading from his book, his 1999 book, Eternal Echoes, Celtic Reflections on Our Yearning to Belong. He writes, to be human is to belong. Belonging is a circle that embraces everything. If we reject it, we damage our nature. Listen, the word belonging holds together two fundamental aspects of life, being and longing. The longing of our being and the being of our longing. Belonging is deep. Only in a superficial sense does it refer to our external attachment to people, places, and things. The scholars don't think that, but the poet does. It's living and passionate presence of the soul. Belonging is the heart and warmth of intimacy. When we deny it, we grow cold and empty. Our life's journey is the task of refining our belonging so that it may become more true, loving, good, and free. Wow, right? So I started with this aspect, an Irish poet, because my very own daddy was an Irish poet. So I started with that. And so now I'm going to appeal to some of the rest of you who may be like, oh my God, is she going to have this much poetry here? Who would be interested in hearing about another aspect of my life. I'm a practicing environmental lawyer and professor. And I've recently discovered the work of the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. Within that organization, there's a group working on something that's near and dear to my heart and to the hearts of many people I know in this beloved community, climate justice. These people opine that the climate crisis is not fundamentally an engineering or environmental problem. It's a problem with dominant ways of thinking, of relating to each other, and the dominant systems we've created. To survive and thrive, they write, we must first name the underlying ways that othering got us here, articulate the worldview rooted in belonging that can get us out, practice radical repair, and collectively imagine and co-create new resilient structures. So why did I pick that? There's a lot of other things about belonging, but I did that because some of you may know I've been recently appointed to a new position in the law school. I have this super cool title that I'm still figuring out how to live up to. I'm now the Vice Dean for Innovation, Interdisciplinarity, and Community Impact. So I've been, I know, laughed at that is kind of a long title, right? But one way I feel like the person who put me in that role and the people who agreed to let me be put in that role thinks I fit in because I kind of practice that approach when I'm working with students, when I'm working on things. I think about problems as a wraparound concept. We don't come in from our silos and address things. We have to look at our most persistent problems, our wicked problems, the problems our planet's facing like climate change and other huge problems, and get an approach that brings in and interweaves many people and gets them to stay, to do the work together, to make they feel like they belong. Because that's how we're going to get out of the things that are plaguing our world, by starting to think and interact very differently. So staying in my scholarly role, I've read a lot of peer-reviewed articles on belonging. There's a lot of stuff out there. Not so much from like 10 or 20 years ago, but recently a lot of people have been writing about belonging. And so just 2 years ago, actually 3 years ago now, a group of scholars led by Kelly Ann Allen from Australia, she's affiliated with a couple of the big universities there, she and her co-authors wrote a piece in the Australian Journal of Psychology entitled Belonging, a review of conceptual issues, an integrative framework, and directions for future research. Because again, this rebirth of belonging as a research area. And they note, quote, a sense of belonging, the subjective feeling of deep connections within social groups, physical places, individual and collective experiences, is a fundamental human need that predicts numerous mental, physical, social, economic, and behavioral outcomes. However, they note, varying perspectives on how belonging should be conceptualized, assessed, and cultivated have been hampered in much needed progress on this timely and important topic. So they announced this, they did the research, they announced this, and they went on. They're continuing to do a lot of research, and so Dr. Allen has continued. She recently wrote The Need to Belong, a deep dive into the origins, implications, and a future of foundational constructs. So she's keeping going, as are lots of other scholars. These wave of experts are coming out, finding things, and some like people in management schools are looking at, key performance indicators of belonging. So people are doing this in their own worlds, in their own scholarly worlds. I could do a whole sermon on this, and you all are like, oh my God, is she going to read us more footnotes? I'm not, I swear I'm not. So let's go back to the exercise that I had you all do that you were very engaged in when you were thinking about a time that you felt like you really belonged. So think about, how did that make you feel when you felt like you belonged? What was a magical thing that happened that got you to feeling like you belonged? So I came up with this exercise because I come up with a lot of exercise. I work with law students and I have to get them engaged because I can lecture about the Code of Federal Regulations for hours. You can ask my kids because when they're stuck in the car with me, I do. But I try to do interactive exercises. So I came up with this exercise. I went in the shower, and I got out of the shower, tell myself on, put on a robe and rushed out to write it down so that I could make sure that I had a slide about it in here. And some of you know I cohabit with a few felines. 5 felines. So the felines came over to help me write this down, as they are wont to do, or gathered in the living room. They didn't really, because some of them help me. So one of them helps me by sitting on me and on my hands as I'm trying to type, and making sure that happens. And one kind of cuddles up right touching me, making sure, and then one kind of sits over on the couch and watches for a little while on the other side of the couch. One sits on the table and watches. And they're all cats who know that they belong. They're with me in the room, but they're behaving very differently. The one who sits very far away will sometimes come. The one who sits on the other side of the couch usually moves and gets rubbed, but then if I move too quickly to actually pat, runs away. So I think that they're just my little microcosm of felines actually goes back to the research that I was reading about that these people are doing. in the outside world in these peer-reviewed journals. So I had this little microcosm of these felines who live with me, showing me that achieving a sense of belonging is best not when you just tried something for the masses, but when you individualize what happens. Somebody needs to be sitting on me just without my permission at that moment, and somebody needs to be touching me, and somebody needs to be near me, and somebody just needs to be able to see me, and that is something that I can make happen for all of them, and then all the cats feel like they belong. So, yeah. Yes, this is a very eclectic, to talk about peer reviews, and my cats, haha. Some of us have heard the word belonging more and more in lots of other sectors recently. Since George Floyd, we've had a lot of people dedicating and ramping up spaces and assignments that they had for people in various settings. Schools, universities, corporations, organizations have had what they called diversity, equity, inclusion, whatever. They had these things, and they really ramped up a few years ago. And in the past couple of years, a lot of them have been, I've heard these people referred to as DEIB officers, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging officers. This has become something formal. It's now in the formal name of the law school's title for this office, for UB's School of Law. And so as we're thinking about the fights that are now happening with respect to whether diversity should be funded, as all this other stuff that's worthy of a whole other sermon, I come back to the word belonging, and I think to myself, if we think about the addition of belonging and then using belonging as something to kind of reframe the important aspects that people are fighting about, maybe we can keep the conversation healthy and less antagonistic and continue our work in this area. And as it happens, a recent book that I read helps me think this through. I belong to a professional book club, so I also like the book club here, but I belong to a professional book club, and we are reading, I bring my books to share with you all. We are reading a 2002 amazing book called The Conscious Workplace, Fortify Your Culture to Thrive in Any Crisis, by this amazing woman, Shara Roman. And while this book is about workplace culture, it offers lessons for any kind of community, the way that I read it at least, including us at UU Amherst. In the closing chapter, the author writes, "You can't bring out the best in people and foster community and belonging if you don't create places that are psychologically safe for, let's substitute people rather than employees, for people to share, be themselves, and be engaged. Having a place to work where you are respected, valued, and listened to is going to be paramount to the future. Businesses need to consider the holistic needs of their people beyond the basics. Well-being is a state of mind and security that has to be both built and modeled. Businesses and other organizations play an important role in creating communities and in implementing the support structures that community gives us. Keep in mind that community isn't about programs, it's a way of being." Let me read that again. Community isn't about programs, it's a way of being. So when you think about diversity and equity and inclusion, it has to be integrated into how you operate as a community. It's all about genuinely fostering belonging and places where we can be our true selves. Whoops. The rest of the book tells both success stories and places where people in these corporations that they studied bumped around, the bumpy stuff, where it's hard, and gave ideas for how to get through that. There's a lot of books like that out there and a lot of stories to learn from. So those of us, now I'm switching, I should have taken a deep breath. So those of us who've been at UU Amherst, or in any UU space, or actually in any space where there's community that gathers, have experienced bumps. Here, we've experienced bumps, even though we worship together, do committee work together, celebrate together. We have to work through our differences together. And we have to do it in a way that makes sure that people leave feeling like they belong, even if there are differences, even if there are bumpy times. It's mutual work. We have to do the best to recognize that others need to be helped to feel like they belong. And here's another thing that I've learned, and I've learned this really well in this community and in my work with the Central Eastern Region Summer Institute. Sometimes it's about me figuring out how I've othered myself from a situation and how I have to step back and then bring myself to a place where I can make moves to help me belong. Sometimes the sense of belonging is something that's happening from people around me, and sometimes the sense of not belonging is something that I've done and that I need to reframe for myself. And we need to do this here. And then our faith calls us to take those lessons out into the many other spaces that are less safe than this beloved church, and maybe bring this nascent expertise in nurturing belonging to the wider world. And you know what? We have a lot of people in this space who can help us with that. Some of them recently left. Today, my son Simon is joining us. He's on a break for Patriots Day from UMass Amherst, where he's studying physics and math. Sorry, brag about my son. So he came here when he was in kindergarten. And by the middle of that year, and certainly by first grade, this was a place that he knew he belonged. And it took me a couple years to feel like I belonged here. My kids felt like they belonged. What's happening in these spaces? And more important, we're like, oh, kids are just easy, blah, blah. But what can we learn from our youth? What can we learn from our littles and our youth? What can we learn from the people who've been in leadership roles at Summer Institute, like Simon and his big sister Tate? What can we learn from our youth and young adults? How can we take the energy that happened in this room? We're all in this together. How can we get that into a space that's more regularized for us in our day-to-day work? In other words, how can we really live into that song from Hal Walker? Whoever you are, we welcome you. Wherever you come from, we welcome you. Whomever you love, we welcome you. I'm almost done, but I have a couple more things. And I'm going to read you another poem. This is a poem by Jan Richardson. Jan is an artist, writer, and ordained minister in the United Methodist Church. And Jan writes, "What does it mean to be a people of belonging?" Jan writes, "You hardly knew how hungry you were to be gathered in, to receive the welcome that invited you to enter entirely. Tentative steps began settling in. You began to breathe again. You learned to sing. But the deal with this blessing is that it will not leave you alone. It will not let you linger. This blessing will ask you to leave. Not because it's tired of you, but because it desires for you to become the sanctuary that you have found." So I stand up here to invite you to think about what you can do to help yourself know you truly belong here, even when it's bumpy, even when it's hard. You truly belong in the other places in your life. Or if you don't belong, you need to find a place you belong. What can you do to help yourself make sure those belonging is happening? What can you do to help others stay in the sense of belonging? What can you do to prepare for the bumpy times? And how can we collectively come back to a sense of belonging or to help somebody else? Finally, we're going to the final slide. We're going to the final slide. Hey! So I'm a professor. I promised you this at the beginning. I'm going to leave you with an assignment. What can you do to build beloved belonging? and rebuild beloved belonging in the spaces you connect with. What do you want to try? What do you want to release? What can you imagine? Thank you.